Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I am so excited to kick off Victober by chatting about some great places to start with Victorian literature. So some people, including my husband, have been asking me for suggestions of good books to start with if they are newer to Victorian literature or have never read any Victorian literature before and are looking to get into it. I think some people can get very overwhelmed and daunted by Victorian literature because Victorian novels tend to be longer, or people are afraid that they'll get bogged down in the somewhat antiquated language. So I've selected some books that might be good entry points to Victorian literature that aren't too dense and might feel more approachable to modern readers. And if you aren't new to Victorian literature, you may have already read all of these, but if you haven't, I highly recommend adding these to your TBR. They're all excellent books and will ignite or reignite your passion for Victorian literature. So onto the books. One of the first Victorian novels I ever read and that really got me into Victorian literature as a teenager is one that is very popular and one that you've probably heard of before, but I'd like to still recommend it to you, and that, of course, is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I feel like this is a lot of people's first foray into Victorian literature, and it seems to be especially popular with teenage girls. Because it's narrated in first person, I feel like it is fairly approachable and accessible to modern audiences and just not too challenging to follow along with. Jane Eyre is about an orphan who we follow as she grows up. We see her endure childhood hardships, living with her neglectful aunt and cruel cousins, as well as surviving poor conditions at boarding school. As a young woman, she becomes a governess at Thornfield Hall, but something seems a bit off about the place, and Jane starts to unravel the mysteries of her employer's past and the house that she lives in while trying to secure her own happiness. When I first read this book, I fell in love with the character of Jane. She has this subtle persistence and tenacity. She's a character that I really identified with as a teenager. She's just trying to find her place in the world and reconcile her fierce individualism with what society expects of her. The suspense of trying to figure out what is going on at Thornfield Hall, as well as the romance plot, make this a fast and engaging read. And it has one of the best plot twists I've ever read. Hopefully it hasn't already been spoiled for you if you haven't read it yet. It's this wonderful gothic book with some fairy tale elements in it, but it's also firmly grounded in reality. It'll help new readers learn a bit about class in the Victorian era and gender and religion as well. This one is a great introductory book, a great book overall, and a book that has a very special place in my heart. It's actually one of the few books that I reread regularly. Another really great place to start with Victorian literature, and another one of the first Victorian novels I ever read, is Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This book is gothic and gruesome and perfect for the spooky season of October. It's great for mystery or sci-fi fans as well, and it feels very dark and suspenseful. The plot twist of Jekyll and Hyde has more or less made its way into pop culture, but even if you're familiar with the phrase Jekyll and Hyde, there's so much fun and intrigue in this book. And to be honest, a familiarity with the plot may help make this an easier read for you. Plot-wise, this book isn't hard for a modern reader to follow, but it explores Victorian themes with such depth. It looks at morality, good and evil, and the duality of man. It looks at the importance of reputation and how it can be so easily speculated on or tarnished. It focuses on the facade of society and how the appearance of a respectable Victorian gentleman can hide unseemly secrets and unspeakable horrors. It looks at science and progress in the era, as well as race and social Darwinism. Basically, it brushes on so many topics that mark the Victorian era and also reveals Victorians' biggest fears. And did I mention how short this one is? I think it's technically a novella, not a novel, so it's a breeze to get through. Another book that's very short and easy to read, but has so much to offer thematically, is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This one is another Gothic tale. I think that there are so many Gothic horror books on this list because suspense is something that propels and motivates readers, and it might be easier to overlook some of the more antiquated language if you're propelled by plot, like you are with some of these. Anyway, The Picture of Dorian Gray is about a character who lives a life of crime and debauchery. While his physical appearance remains untouched by age and bears no signs of his misdeeds, his secret portrait grows more foul and ugly each and every day. The book examines themes of morality and art, of unchecked desire. It's a really interesting read, and its themes feel very relevant today. I don't think you need to know much about the time period to find a connection and relevance to these themes. And then if you think of Victorian literature, I bet there's one author that most notably comes to your mind. This list, of course, cannot continue without a Dickens novel. And I'm not going to give you one, but two places to start with Dickens. Dickens is a phenomenal author whose name is basically synonymous with Victorian literature, but many of his books are daunting in size. Most of the Dickens books on my shelves are around 800 pages, give or take, and he is famous for sentences that go on and on and on for an entire paragraph. Not to mention he makes up his own words and has a habit of referring to characters by nicknames that he created for them a page or two ago, and that you might have missed if you weren't quite paying attention. I've actually come to find all of these characteristics of his writing endearing, but they can be very overwhelming at first. These two suggestions should be able to ease you into Dickens nicely, though. A really great place to start with Dickens and Victorian literature in general is actually A Christmas Carol. There are so many adaptations of A Christmas Carol, and the story is so infused into our pop culture that you're probably familiar with it already, which makes it easier to overcome any difficulties you might have with Dickens's writing. And this book has great characters. Scrooge and the Cratchits and the descriptions of all the ghosts are just brilliant. And A Christmas Carol actually has a lot in common with books about the Industrial Revolution in the ways which it explores class and morality. It combats popular ideas of poverty. Ideas like the poor are poor because they choose to be, or are lazy, or have some moral failing that keeps them poor, or are degenerates who are inherently less deserving. This book condemns misers like Scrooge and advocates that people who have money should use it and share it to benefit the community. And that, of course, ties in really well with the concept of the Christmas spirit. So while this is, of course, for Christmas, it actually has quite a bit of socio-politic commentary, and it's an interesting path into Victorian literature. The other place I'd recommend starting with for Dickens, and another great introduction to Victorian literature, is Great Expectations. Like Jane Eyre, this one is a first-person narrative which centers around one main character, and both of these things make it an easier read than some other Victorian books. Dickens usually has a million different side characters and plots that can be very difficult to keep track of, but the plot in Great Expectations really centers around the main character, Pip. And because of the first-person narrative, we're introduced to the other characters a little more gradually, and it's just easier to read and keep track of everything that's happening. And yet, you still get a taste of the way Dickens writes and how fantastic his plots are. The plot in Great Expectations is still very Dickensian. It still has big reveals and plot twists and multiple threads that come together in the end, but in this book, everything is appropriately surprising without being overly complicated. Plus, it's not the shortest Dickens book, but it's one of the shortest Dickens books. Great Expectations is about an orphan named Pip, who was brought up by his sister and her husband, and he's in training to be a blacksmith when he's informed that he has great expectations, that he has a mysterious benefactor, and that he's to go to London to learn how to be a gentleman. So it's kind of a rags to riches story. There's a bit of mystery on who this mysterious benefactor is, and why Pip has been chosen for this opportunity. It explores class and what it means to be a gentleman, as well as Victorian ideals of love and marriage. It's a really great introduction to so many Victorian themes, and it has one of my favorite characters, Miss Havisham. She is just a marvelous creation. She's an old woman who was left at the altar when she was younger, and she lives in this dilapidated, massive house, still dressed in her wedding gown, with all of the clocks stopped at the very time her husband didn't show up to the wedding. And she lives there with her adopted daughter, Estella, who she's raised as a heartbreaker to get revenge on the entire male sex. There are so many interesting aspects to this book, and it's just a phenomenal read and a brilliant introduction to Dickens and Victorian literature. Another solid place to begin your Victorian literature journey is with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. These are both novels and short stories, so if you aren't interested in committing to something very long, this might be a good choice for you. There are also so many adaptations that you could watch and follow along with that can help your understanding of the text. It might be nice to start at the very beginning with A Study in Scarlet, where Sherlock and Watson meet each other for the first time and embark on their very first case. It's really fun to see the relationship between these two characters form and develop, but some people say you're better off starting with a different entry point to Sherlock because the second half of this story is a bit strange in the way it transitions to Salt Lake City, Utah. The Hound of the Baskervilles or The Sign of Four may be other good places to start with these iconic characters. And then, if longer works don't scare you off, you might want to begin your Victorian literature journey with a Wilkie Collins book. I recommend either The Woman in White or The Moonstone. Both of these feel like quick reads despite their size, and it's so easy to get swept up into the plot of these two. The Woman in White begins with a drawing teacher traveling to a new job teaching two girls when he sees this startling apparition, a mysterious, distressed woman dressed all in white. He helps her on her journey, only to find out very shortly afterwards that she has escaped from an insane asylum. When he gets to his new job, it becomes apparent that his encounter with the woman is somehow linked to his two new students, and the three of them become caught up in this mystery of the woman in white. This book is so much fun to read. The story is plot-heavy, full of twists and turns, and the pacing is excellent. It's told from perspectives of a bunch of different characters and has a wonderful atmosphere of suspense and tension that's very easy to get swept up in. The book deals with themes of marriage and secrets and class and mental illness in really interesting ways, and it's just such a fun introduction to Victorian literature or an introduction to Wilkie Collins. Or if you're interested in Wilkie Collins, you might want to start with The Moonstone. It's considered to be one of the first, if not the first, English detective novels. It's a delightful page-turning adventure that is so funny and so fun to read. It's about a diamond called the Moonstone that was stolen from a Hindu temple and years later passed down to a woman on her 18th birthday. But the night of her birthday party, the Moonstone goes missing, and everyone who made an appearance at the party or who is part of the household where the party took place is a suspect. The characters who narrate this one are so fun, especially Mr. Betteridge, who is a servant in the household and is so loyal and opinionated and funny. And there's also this amazing detective figure, Sergeant Cuff, who is just brilliant. I love how the book is structured to encourage the reader to play detective as well, and it explores some really interesting themes including race and imperialism and physical difference in the Victorian period. The book also looks at theft in fascinating ways and leads the reader to question the crime at the heart of this novel. Is the crime stealing from the Hindu temple or from the birthday girl? The story is built on this initial curse of imperialism, and the book does a beautiful wonderful job of linking ordinary domestic English life to imperialism and the greater English empire. And then the last book I'm going to recommend is by one of my favorite Victorian authors, and that is Elizabeth Gaskell. If you'd like to get into Victorian literature, you might want to read North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. She's written some fabulous other works as well, but I think the best one of hers to start with is North and South. It's about a woman named Margaret Hale who moves with her family from the south of England to the north, to a town that's based on Manchester. We follow the family's life there, their views of society, and how they adapt to their new environment, and interact with some wonderful characters they meet there. The book takes a very interesting approach to industrialization in the Victorian era, with wonderful characters and a tiny bit of romance in the plot. It explores work and the concept of meritocracy. It examines whether those of a higher class have a paternalistic responsibility to take care of the working classes, and the implications social mobility might have on thoughts surrounding work. Oddly, it actually has similar themes to A Christmas Carol, and you wouldn't think that the two books would have so much in common, but they do. I feel like North and South is a great introduction to themes of class and industrialization in the Victorian age, if you're particularly interested in that aspect of the era. And then, of course, if you like North and South, Gaskell has plenty of other phenomenal books that you can go to next, like Cranford and Wives and Daughters. So those are all the books I'd like to recommend to you today. I hope that these books get you excited about trying Victorian literature for the first time, or excited about picking up more Victorian literature. I would love to hear in the comment section down below what you are most excited to read, and if you've read any Victorian literature before, what was the first Victorian book that you read, and how did you get on with it? Are you looking forward to picking up any of these books? I hope you have a wonderful Victober. Until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another bookish and likely Victorian video very soon. Bye!